Our next panel explores the next-gen material investment landscape. We've been seeing more and more investment in the space over the years. I'm sure you've heard our statistics, so we've mentioned earlier today and yesterday. And so this panel should be a really interesting discussion. I'd like to welcome our moderator, Elaine Su, Chief Innovation Officer. She was also the main author of our State of the Industry report and Brand Engagement report. And I'd like to invite the panelists to join. Karla Mora, founder and managing partner of Alante Capital. Corinna Chen, partner of Material Impact. Heather Courtney, CEO of Alwyn Capital. And Stephen Chambers, partner at SOSV.
Thank you, Nicole, for the introduction, and welcome all our panelists and the audience. We've talked a lot about investment today and yesterday. Investment can come from many different stakeholders. We've talked about investment needing from brands, definitely material innovators themselves taking a lot of the risk as well. We've also talked about whether it is public money versus as in government funding or sponsoring versus private money. I think for this panel, it's really great that we have all these investors here with us so we can dive deeper into that aspect. You have heard a lot of these numbers from yesterday and today. The trend is definitely very encouraging that we're seeing a lot more money being invested into this space, and deals are getting bigger. Just as of Q1 this year, we have some really exciting deals. Michael Works had a successful Series C round, raising $125 million. Natural Fiber Welding had a Series B, raising $85 million. Vitro Labs, $39 million, Series A. So lots happening here, but we've also heard about a lot of challenges, a lot of sort of barriers, bottlenecks, etc. And we want to explore those in this panel as well. So I'm going to start with asking the panelists to each to introduce yourself. And also, if you can talk a little bit about how next-gen materials fit into your firm's investment thesis, or name one or maybe more next-gen material company that your firm has invested in. Should we start with Karla?
Sure. Thanks, Elaine, and hi, everybody. It's great to be here. What an inspiring conference. I've just really enjoyed what I've tuned into today, so thanks for doing that. I'm the founding managing partner of Alante Capital, which was created about 5 years ago now, with a mission to help support a systemic change within the apparel industry. So we're very focused on this. I would call it niche, but as all of you know, this is an enormous industry with a tremendous amount of challenges. So the opportunities are huge here. And what we really focus on is the back end of the industry. We don't invest in any brands. That's not part of our thesis. We want to support all of the brands to have the materials, the chemistries, the dyes, the design tools, the transparency software, all of that, so that they can actually get to the 100% bio, like we were talking about in the last panel just before this, or fully recyclable, or, you know, we wanted to help to scale the tools that's going to get them there. So that's what Alante does. And we look at the entire kind of back end circular economy. So we look at production as well as distribution. We spend a lot of time on use. So we look at durability, how can we increase utility from a customer perspective, rental, resale, repair, and then ultimately recycle, and how do we create the infrastructure and the chemistries that are needed to really start to deal with the waste coming from the industry and get it right back into the system. So I'll stop there. It's great to be here. Am I supposed to talk about the companies we've invested in? We have 4 in the materials space. Not exactly next gen, but they're all next generation biomaterials or chemistries in one way or another. We have Mango Materials, which is biodegradable. They're making something that's like a biodegradable polyester fiber from waste methane gas. We have Circ, which is a recycling company that breaks down post-consumer garment waste, blended fibers, and brings back recycled poly and a man-made cellulosic fiber. We have Sway, which is a biopackaging company made from seaweed as a feedstock that is going to be making home compostable and biodegradable poly bags, retail bags, and poly mailers. And then we just invested this week, which is very exciting, in a company called Novaloop, which is taking plastic waste that was previously unrecyclable and being able to recycle it to create a TPU product to start. There's others. So that's that.
Thank you, Karla. Really good to have you. Should we move on to Corinna?
Hi, thank you, everybody. Been really excited about the conference. A little bit about myself and Material Impact. So I'm a partner at Material Impact, which we're a Boston-based deep tech firm. And so we focus on a lot of investments, I would say primarily on the technical side, but we do look to make investments that ultimately make a difference in environmental and sustainability concerns. Us, in terms of looking at the technology, we understand that the fashion and textiles industry is, top 5 polluting industry. And, we are looking to kind of make a dent in kind of bringing in new sustainable and new materials into the market. So, our angle in terms of looking at it is, for me, primarily focused on, I would probably say next gen, but synbio oriented technologies that enable next gen biomaterials. We're active right now in investing. And one of the things that we look for is kind of limiting, or I would say opening up the biotechnical bottleneck in terms of getting there, moving forward, not just in biomaterials, but really being able to engineer and with a high focus on scalability. One of the things that's a strong consideration for us is that we can make a larger change, a larger impact when we identify technologies and materials that can scale, that brands and textile supplier manufacturers are excited to make that switch so that we can drive adoption and start really seeing this in the masses. Material Impact, we've been pretty active in investments. We have an investment called Galley, who's in cellular agriculture and looking for ways to basically synbio cotton. And right now I'm active in 2 synbio textiles deal. I'm kind of doing them right now, so I can't say what they are, but one's seed stage and one is a Series A, where one is focused on a biopolymer with designer protein to infuse performance into a biodegradable, base. And the other is working on synbio-oriented colorants and dyes, focusing on textiles. So we're pretty excited about it and always looking for more. These are platform technologies, and where we feel like that these companies can tackle different avenues of the textile/fashion industries. And like Karla mentioned, we're not really focused on brand investment per se, but we really want to be able to bring new materials into the market that can be utilized.
Thank you so much, Corinna. We'll definitely touch upon a lot of these points in our chat. Steve, would you like to go next?
Okay, thanks, Elaine. So my name's Stephen Chambers. I'm managing director at IndieBio New York. I'm also a GP at SOSV, which is the VC kind of arm behind IndieBio. So we have a kind of fairly broad investment thesis, human and planetary health. That's our main focus, and it covers a very diverse portfolio of over 1,000 companies, $1 billion under management. So we have a large portfolio to call upon. I have a number of kind of biomaterials, next gen biomaterials that we've invested in, kind of MycoWorks, Algenet, more recently Bucha Bio and Tomtex. So we're kind of active players in the next gen material space. My own experience is I have a background in, my training is a biochemist. I have a PhD in molecular biology, kind of founded a number of companies as a kind of scientific founder and also co-founder of a number of companies, mainly in the drug discovery and development kind of space, Vertex Pharmaceuticals, Protherapeutics. So that's my background, but I've moved more recently into synbio and made a number of investments in the synbio space, eventually ending up at IndieBio in New York. I think when I look at the companies that we've been talking about, for the past 2 days, I think, what stands out, and it's very difficult to sort of make kind of like these sweeping discussions about kind of like the companies that we're seeing. But I think there is an inflection point that we're seeing, and that's what we recognize. We've seen it in the food space, and now we're seeing it in the materials space. We believe there is an inflection point occurring at the moment. We believe that materials will definitely go faster than food. Obviously, it doesn't have the regulatory component, but we're seeing a lot of the elements that we saw within alternative food space, like protein, plant protein, and also cellular protein, now manifesting themselves in material space. So we're really excited about this area. Typically, we're very early stage. So we invest in very early stage companies. Typically, we're the first institutional check that goes into companies, and we work very closely alongside these companies.
Awesome, and thoroughly enjoyed a lot of the sessions that you were involved in already, Steve. Thank you very much for joining us. And last but not least, Heather.
Hi, thank you, Elaine. My name is Heather Courtney. I run Alwyn Capital. We're an early stage US-based investment firm with a global investment focus. We cover 3 verticals: biotech, materials, and food, from pre-seed to Series A. We look for companies that are developing technologies that will help us accelerate the global transition away from a reliance on animal products. So far, we've invested in House of Fluff in the material space, which is developing an alternative to animal fur, and Uncaged Innovations, which is tackling a sustainable and plant-based alternative to animal leather. Personally, I have a degree in biochemistry from University of Florida and a degree in photography and communication from Parsons School of Design. Prior to founding Alwyn, I worked as a neuropharmaceutical researcher. So Steve, you and I have biochemistry in common. And then I shifted gears when I realized I wasn't going to make any kind of progress by refusing to test on animals in a lab. So I became a consultant to fashion brands, helping them craft visual narratives that would tell their brand stories. I've been in the plant-based movement tracking innovation in this sector for over 2 decades. And like Steve, we've witnessed the explosion of the plant-based food market, and strongly believe that we're on the precipice of seeing a similar trajectory in next-gen materials market.
Thank you so much, Heather. I think this launches very nicely into my first question, which is, let's start broadly with the investors' sort of lens on. I want to, this question for Steve and Heather. So maybe I'll start with Steve. As you mentioned, SOSV has a very big scope. I was wondering, as you look at next-gen materials, you've talked a little bit about sort of the comparison with alternative proteins and seeing the parallels there, and kind of figuring out, the same kind of trend might happen or even faster. How are you looking at next-gen materials sort of fitting into your thesis? What's its potential to deliver returns and impact, and what excites you most at this point?
We definitely think we can identify some companies that are going to move faster than others. And I don't want to lean too heavily on the food analogy, but it is there. There is kind of, we kind of got into plant proteins relatively quickly, one could say, in the past couple of years. And we believe that that kind of creep is what we're going to see in the materials. We're seeing it already, that the biomaterials, like on the previous panel, someone kind of described it as, we know where we are. We're not really where we want to be eventually. There are kind of chimeric kind of next-gen materials that have backings and have certain products in them that we wouldn't necessarily like. So what we're seeing is kind of this mission creep, where we're starting at one place and we're seeing a lot of recycling companies, okay? And like the fully fledged de novo biomaterial might be a bit way off. But what we're seeing is basically this creep in technology as this kind of industry grows. We're seeing a lot of kind of traction with drop-in solutions, alt bio kind of alternatives, finishes, So not the full material that we envisage, although we are seeing that, and we've made investments in that. But we're seeing a lot of kind of companies that are basically being on the sustainability side of things, replacing oil products and kind of non-sustainable products in that supply chain with bio alternatives.
Right. Maybe a follow-up question in that when you said that it's kind of drop in, like, so we actually in the immediately previous panel, it was talked about like 40 different components go into a pair of shoe. So is that kind of what you're talking about? Like, it's companies that are focused on like different little components that goes into a final product, but not necessarily the entire material. But probably it's not, given how things are made and how many components need to go into there, is it possible to have like the complete material?
Yeah, like often with very early stage companies, what we say to them is start selling to the customer. Start like, even if it's just like one element of the final product, just start selling, start talking to the customer, start kind of immersing yourself in that supply chain, in that industry, and start figuring out what they need, what problems they have, where are their pain points, and see if you can start delivering on kind of maybe not the whole solution, but maybe it's just a small pain point, so you can start understanding it. Because a lot of our early stage companies, they have like no concept of how this sector works, and what they need to do is embed themselves in the sector and start learning how their technology can resolve certain problems, rather than saying, oh, I'm going to have this material and these folks are going to use it. It's not going to, you're going to have to work with the industry that's already in place and start, helping them resolve certain issues that they have around sustainability, around use of materials, around inputs. So it's kind of like, it does tend to be kind of piecemeal to begin with. And then it tends to sort of, once they're sort of, they start delivering to the customer, start talking to the customer and understanding it, that what happens is they start selling them other things as well along the way.
Right. And you mentioned that there are a lot of companies that you're seeing that are, let's say, replacing petroleum-based sourced materials. How do you see that in terms of creating impact? Because as we've heard these 2 days, sustainability, obviously everybody has a bit of a different definition, and different people would have different weight of like what has to be done first, what's more important, or it has to be, it's a give and take. Sustainability is a huge topic. From your perspective, what kind of impact do you focus on, or you look for?
Like we do talk like blindly about synthetic biology, but we really do believe that the ability to engineer biology is kind of one of these fundamental kind of shifts that we're seeing, especially in the economy. Again, we can talk about the 20th century being an oil-based economy. A lot of synthetic chemistry was built around the oil industry, and basically, not only to just produce food, but to, produce drugs, but also produce materials as well. So, and what we're seeing is the shift in this century is more a bioeconomy, which is based on our ability to engineer biology, sort of create a lot of the inputs that we need from biological sources, and that's being powered by synthetic biology and our ability to engineer biology and power those changes. So we think, probably as other investors on this panel as well, that this is kind of one of the drivers, one of the most powerful drivers that we see that's going to change the trajectory.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Heather kind of the same question too, but kind of zooming in a little bit more, because Alwyn Capital focuses on taking animals out of the supply chain. So how is Next Gen Materials a big, hopefully, or a big or small part of that? What's your view on its current state and its potential to deliver returns and impact?
Well, I mean, materials are a huge part of our mission thesis, because we realize that you can't tackle one part of the problem without tackling another. And although leather and beef often come from the same slaughterhouse, leather isn't just a byproduct of the beef industry, because farmers don't sell every single part of each animal to minimize waste, but they focus on trying to maximize profit. So there's an interdependency there in the beef and leather trade, and we have to solve for both problems. If you look at the industries as a whole, there's numbers that a lot of different research firms have put out, but the ones that we found that have been the most consistent are that the global beef industry was valued at $324 billion in 2020, and the global leather market was at $350 billion that same year. So there's definitely the appetite from a total addressable market perspective to make both profits and impact in the material space, just from a leather perspective. And then, fur and exotics are a completely different matter. Those animals are bred and killed specifically for their skins. So if we can provide brands with alternatives and we can educate consumers, we have the opportunity to make a massively profitable industry, and we can save millions of lives at the same time.
Thank you so much, Heather, because I think throughout these 2 days, we've seen a lot of those questions about, is it byproduct or not byproduct, in the comment section. So you put it there very, very nicely with numbers and all that. So that's like put it to rest. I'd like to ask Corinna. So you mentioned about deep tech innovations. That's sort of what you focus on. I want to ask that, have you been seeing a lot of such innovation in this space, in next-gen materials that excite you? Hopefully there are. If not, why not? And I want to then talk a little bit about the scalability point that you made as well.
Sure. I think the roads are all leading to basically bioproducts. And when you look at it from that lens, a lot of what we're doing is, the technology before hadn't been that accessible where it would make sense to invest and develop biomaterials that is not drug development and so forth. So for us, we see this also as an opportunity where if we can provide better tools, if we have better tools to do so, we can, one, discover and innovate more quickly, and then two, really be able to kind of, I would say kind of like a transition in tech development is basic science and then the bioproduct development. Before, they've been one and the same, and a company was expected to do everything. But what we're seeing here, and what I think that's exciting for next gen materials, is having that infrastructure where we can more quickly high throughput test, where we can more quickly discover. When we're talking about materials and the transition to bio, what we're talking about is making that bridge between DNA and then the physical world proteins. What is leather but collagen? What are all these alternatives? And if we can start mimicking that. Same thing with food ingredients and so forth. And we've already seen that in the food space. And so what we're doing is kind of tackling, if you think about the textiles and fashion space, it's more, highly more fragmented and so forth. So what I see here is investments or deep tech innovations that allows companies to utilize basic science so that they're not having to build two teams to make bioproducts, where they can utilize how to quickly get proteins, how to quickly test, how to go through and understand what are these new materials from a fundamental perspective, so that when we're thinking about, utilizing biology into synbio, what is that really? I would say in the general public's term is, besides manipulating biology, is making it more accessible to the highest, most premium industries like drug development. So high throughput testing, quicker to discovery, and then along the biostack, focusing on proteins, so to kind of get you to that innovation quicker in a more of a physical world material sense. So I think that's the kind of things we're seeing where it's going to propel innovation in terms of next-gen material options, simply because more tools and more accessibility is really kind of driving that to a point where it makes sense to tackle the plethora of opportunities in the material space.
Right. And you also mentioned about tech that will help scale all these things. Can you dive a little bit deeper into what does that mean? And yeah.
Sure. So I think there's a couple of examples and it's a little different. So let's say, for example, a lot of times if you're looking for like a real bio alternative, and I'll go to, we had mentioned that I know Vitro Labs has sponsored, but we're talking about basically protein-based leathers. And part of doing so is be able to manufacture, which is basically greater efficiency in fermentation, greater efficiencies in bioreactions to get to the scale to drive down that cost. And so when we're investing in that type of technique and these type of platforms, then what we're really talking about is that platform is available and we're talking about different inputs. So for example, right now, I would say the first iteration is leather alternatives, things that aren't made of collagen-based protein that is leather. But now we're really moving kind of towards an option to really think about using it's basically the fundamental same structural component, but again, without the animals, without the cost to agriculture and so forth. So I think that's kind of where we're going to. And you see this in food as well. We have, and we've mentioned this throughout the conference a little bit, plant-based burgers. Well, we know that there's an appetite for, burgers just without cows. And that's kind of where I see that deep tech is going, so that when that technology is available, then we can innovate on these bioproducts and not having to wrestle with fundamental science and then product innovation.
Right. I want to kind of ask Steve about, because I know you've mentioned a few times about scalability and the worry that sustainability is kind of a luxury. Do you want to add anything here in terms of scale? Things
Like it is a sensitive kind of point, like like when we these materials, we don't want just these materials to be couture or Louis Vuitton or Stella McCartney. Like we really do want H&M to sort of pick up these materials, and kind of like we want to go for the mass market. I do get a bit worried. I do understand that the early adopters for a lot of these will be the high-end kind of brands that will be most motivated to sort of get in there, and that's just the way it is. So I'm perfectly okay with that, but I think we shouldn't lose the focus that for true sustainability, we need to sort of to make a difference. Like it's got to be for the masses, okay? Like we've got to kind of completely shift away from traditional ways of making these materials, and that's going to take basically a lot of innovation, a lot of money, and basically producing material that is for everyone, not just for luxury brands. And I think that's kind of one of the things that we kind of really kind of like drill home with our companies, is that this is the early adopters is just the first step along the way, and we've got to resolve the scale problem. That's super important.
Yeah, and I think there are actually two aspects to this, right? One is how you position yourself and market yourself, and actually stage that market positioning, because a lot of it, even in food, we see that why are we expecting that, let's say, meat consumption to be really increasing in certain countries and areas when the living standard is higher and higher? It's not really a survival thing. It is that when people can afford certain lifestyle, then let's say meat, real leather, all these kind of more expensive things are associated with that lifestyle. So therefore the demand for that will increase, and therefore the alternatives are not really just feeding the people, or like it's actually also feeding that need for the luxury, or that need for that lifestyle. And therefore the alternatives actually need to be aspirational. It cannot just be a cheaper version, because then when it comes out to the market positioned that way, then it's not aspirational, and actually it doesn't, probably it hurts the impact in the long run. So that is a stage thing. But so that's the marketing perspective. But in terms of actually how much these things cost and how to get to that price parity, so that there is a future, like after that first staging, then it can actually go down and then get to the mass Yeah,
Yeah.
that's another issue.
I think these new materials, they have to be better. They have to be better than leather. Like they have to be. They can't be, oh, as good as leather, subpar leather. No, they have to be better than leather. And that's, across the whole material, they have to bring something else for people to want to buy them and kind of change the basically purchasing habits. So,
Yeah.
that's the drive that we have. Like it's not good enough to be, just a replacement. It's got to be better. Better produced, and it can be better in different ways, but I definitely think side by side it has to be better.
Yeah, completely agree. I want to talk a little bit about supply chain now with Karla. So some of the barriers actually is along the supply chain. It's, as we've heard these 2 days, extremely complicated. So many players, and different from some industries. Again, the material innovators really seldom have direct interaction with the end consumers. There are so many different parties in between. Where do you see these barriers, or are there white space opportunities along the supply chain that material innovators should pay attention to?
Yes, many of them. And they make me really excited. One of the last things that kept coming up on the last panel with the brands that were using apple leather and some of these next gen leathers, in the comment section, people are talking a lot about the fact that there's still plastic in it. And it's something that we think a lot about. But for me, when I hear about this from brand after brand after brand and designer, and I see that as an opportunity. So how can we replace that, polyurethane with something that can biodegrade or compost or be recycled, whatever is the mission of that brand and that material. So there's opportunities and finishes and chemistries that are enormous, and it's a huge negative impact comes in that space. And it's been hard for me to see as much brand adoption because materials are an easier story to tell. But as more apparel companies that we work with get used to working with biomaterials and different types of material innovation, they're starting to get more appetite and awareness of how to work with startups so they can bring to market new dyes, new chemistries, new finishes, so that we can start to get there. So that's one area on the supply chain that's exciting. For me, I always go back to, we can make the most sustainable products ever. And if we're just mass producing this and overproducing this and it's going into waste and landfill and incineration, this is not ever going to be sustainable. So we also need to be thinking about our production challenges at the brand level, so that we can start to right size the production so that we are actually being able to sell to consumers what they're looking to buy. So for the materials companies who have no touch point to that consumer, it's really important that they become engaged with their future end customer, the brands, early. So, and it's complicated because sometimes too early of engagement with brands can make for very tough R&D. Sometimes it's really great. It really depends on the company and how it's set up. But getting that conversation going early to understand, what are your limitations that you have? What are the margins these brands are working with? So what's the cost point of your competitor that you're trying to replace? What are the quality specs that you're going to need to be able to achieve? How are you thinking about taking up dye, and how are you starting to test that early, and how it falls into the supply chain? So being able to have that ally in the apparel industry that can open doors, bring on the right advisory board who really understands the full supply chain and how your product is going to go through is going to be really important.
I think I'm gonna follow up with the question of then, as an investor, how do you, when you look at a startup and having all these factors that you would consider or advise them on, where do you see the biggest risks and challenges, and how do you assess these risks as an investor?
So there are so many risks and challenges that we're all figuring out how much risk can we take. And so like for our firm and where we are now for Fund One, we have a certain level of risk that we can take. And I think the biggest risk in the biomaterial space is really around scalability and finding things that are going to be able to meet on quality and price within a near enough term. Not to say that keeps us away from it, but it's just something that we have to really dive into as we're starting to understand these new materials. Sometimes it's hard because they haven't even been able to get to a point where they can test to see what the color fastness would be or how the durability will perform. And so you do have to take that bet even before it if you're going to invest in this space. But yeah, I mean, for us, it's, can you get to that economy of scale within whatever area you're in? If you start to produce, we right now can handle drop-in solutions. We are looking at what are the next generation of solutions that will not be drop-in and what is going to be required for them to scale. So I love that, Corinna, that you're looking at that kind of scalability challenge from an investment standpoint on the manufacturing side. But for us, like, we have confines, like we have returns that we have to give to our investors within a time frame. And so we look, when we're investing, and this is often the case for VC funds, is, you have to have that 3 to 5 or 5 to 7 year window of when you expect your exit. And so I think for next gen material companies, you just need to talk to your potential investors and find out where they are in their fundraising timeline. Like, am I in year 6 of my 10-year fund and I need my exit within a couple years? Like, that's going to change my risk that I'm allowed to take. Or am I in year 1 and I know that, worst comes to worst, like, you have 10 years to get out, like, and I believe you can get there. Like, maybe it kind of changes things. And also understanding the ticket size of what your investors are able and willing to do and how they're going to follow along. So, I mean, there's a lot of risks that could go on and on, but I want to talk a little bit more about opportunities for a second, because I didn't address that in the first question. And there's all these amazing scientists listening to this. So a huge part of what Alante does is work closely with apparel companies and suppliers. We have a whole consulting arm of our business that does that, and members that use us for kind of insights into what's happening in innovation. And I hear from them continually, we need, durable water repellency. How are we going to find a good replacement for that? How are we going to find a good replacement for elastane? Something that can add that stretch, that can not mess up the end recycling that we have right now. The chemical recyclers, that's a really challenging fiber for many of them to be able to manage, yet it's in all of our jeans. It's in most of our clothes. So an unlock there, and then silk and nylon. And there's a lot happening in that space, but figuring out what's going on and how are we going to get that to be able to be scalable. I have so many brands that are ready to sign off takes, and R&D, like, these are kind of the unlocks that I see in 3 spaces.
Thank you so much for talking about the opportunities as well. I have my next question is to Heather. You've mentioned that 2 very specific examples, companies that you've invested in. I'm wondering opportunities, challenges that they face, and what advice you have for them, especially kind of through different iterations, right? Because we've talked about it a lot. Things are not perfect at this point. It's all a progress, and you've invested in them, I think, for a few years. So, like, going through that journey with them, along with them pivoting, different iterations. What's your experience in that, and advice?
Yeah, I have three pieces of advice if I have time. 2 for sure. The first one, find an advisor that is in your industry, just like Karla said. You need expertise on what brands are looking for. So find an advisor in your industry that you trust and that's excited about your company, because this industry demands that you have scientific expertise, industry knowledge, and strong sales skills. And if you don't have that in your founding team, then you've got to consider how you can make great hires early on and find an advisor that can fill those gaps in the meantime, and use them. Use your advisor and use your investors. We see companies all the time with like really strong science backgrounds and an understanding of how to innovate in a lab, but that's just one small part of building a successful business in this industry. So you need to consider how to get your materials into the hands of potential buyers, and you need to understand what those buyers are truly looking for in a material. So an advisor can kind of help soften those conversations and make inroads for you with potential buyers, and they'll have a better understanding about what the industry fully needs. The second thing, I'd say consider end of life first. Think about how to handle the end of life cycle of your product up front when you're going into R&D, because I mean, like we've talked about, most of the faux leather and fur options in this market are a PU or PVC base. So as an industry, Next Gen Materials, we think we've got a lot to figure out on how to change that narrative. Because if an industrial compostable product ends up in a landfill, it's great that it's compostable, but if it ends up in the wrong place, it's really just not doing anybody any good. And so it's important to consider what has to happen to get your product in the right place at the end of its life cycle. Does the product need to be disassembled? Does stitching need to be removed? Do you have multiple components that need to go to different destinations? And we all know that this is true in the food space too, but consumers tend to choose the path of least resistance. Mm-hmm. So it becomes our responsibility as producers and an industry to make those better end of life choices easier for them. And, consideration of who your end user is, like what functionality or quality do they expect material? Because if we make products that are really hard to break in or easily damaged during normal use, we're just increasing the likelihood that those garments or products end up contributing to the massive underutilization problem that the entire industry is facing. So listen to your partners, the fashion houses, the automobile producers, footwear designers. And if you don't have an advisor right now that you can call with those questions specific to the industries, the first thing you should be doing is going to find one. But also use your investors as a resource because they are part of your team.
I would actually really love to hear your third point as well. I think we do have time for that, Heather.
So I'll go into, all right. So the last thing is understanding the importance of IP and why are you filing a patent right now? We see a ton of early companies who've spent a large amount of time and capital filing for patents that would really likely have been better served just keeping that technology as a proprietary trade secret. And we hear a lot of times that these early companies think that they need to file patents in order to even be investable by a VC. And it isn't necessarily true. If there's a real reason why you have to file a patent, like it's very good to understand from both investors early on, advisors and legal counsel, why it's so important to file that patent, because we've seen time and time again that companies are raising money to essentially pay for patent filings, and it doesn't always necessarily become the best served use of capital or time.
Wow. I would love to ask Corinna your view on IP protection.
Yeah, I think I would second what Heather said in terms of, I think overall it would be good for companies and young entrepreneurs to think about the strategy in terms of the need. Certainly with the type of investments we do, that's kind of a bit more technology and synbio based, that the patents do become important to differentiate because they're base technology. Let's say a biomaterial that is more process oriented. So, from that perspective, I would say that I think fundamentally it's not whether or not you do IP or versus a trade secret or know-how, but it's more about timing and understanding, what value it brings at what stage of your company. Certainly, if you're just forming the company, I don't think you need to basically file the patent right away. But it's more about being smart about when it makes the most sense and understanding like what is the value proposition, in that example. But I would say largely for larger investments that are more technology based, that is less about process deviation, know-how, and a patent will become more important.
Thank you. I want to move on to ask a question for everyone, really. Where do you think investment is most needed? Where does money need to go? Should we start with Steve?
I think in the scaling up, I think that's kind of the one area that is, there's a lot of companies out there now. Like there's, I can think there's always more, but there's a lot of companies out there now. But the scaling problem is going to keep on coming back to us, and that's I agree with Karla. That's where I see the bump in the road with a lot of companies resolving that issue.
So what about Karla?
So go back to the main question I had, because now I'm thinking about scaling challenges,
Sure.
which I think a lot about.
Where does the investment need to go?
Yeah. Well, so I think that we need a better shared understanding of what types of capital are out there, so people aren't trying to scale everything through venture or on the cap table, because there's a lot of other ways to do it. And I'm glad that to hear that's been brought up at this conference. Scale is definitely important. I love to look at like, where are the materials headed? So we're seeing all of these next gen leathers, next gen silks, all these things, like what is required for them if they're all massively successful. How does that change dyes, finishes, all the other things, and see like kind of what the unlock is in that next step in the supply chain. Because as we see how these things come on board, that creates a lot of new opportunity and innovation across these areas. I think in like the fiber space, we still need to replace the incumbent bad guys, right? So bad guys, but I don't want to live in a sea of trash. And so I really like to think about biodegradability. I see a lot of the apparel companies moving towards like carbon neutrality being that positive as a way to focus in on recycling, but without recycling infrastructure, sorting, prepping, have all of that, like we're just making more waste, and it's an excuse to continue to use synthetic fiber. And I think it's a risk for our biomaterials community, and we play on both sides. Like we work with recyclability, because I need to get rid of all the waste that's here and all the waste that's still going to be coming as bio options come online. But you need to think about, how do you address that carbon? And it's true, a lot of like biomaterials companies, if you look at the feedstock will perform worse on an LCA than say a synthetic, because it's using corn or sugar based, and there's a lot of fertilizer involved. So I like waste based feedstocks, not across the board, but there's some that are really great. And if they already have a supply chain of collecting that waste, and you can co-locate, there are ways to really start to scale this that can start to adjust what the apparel industry is requiring as well when thinking about next gen and sustainability. There's a lot there.
Thanks, Karla. Corinna.
Yeah, for me, the driving adoption is key, and I think part of that we say that that we need to scale, and we certainly need to, but I would say that what drives that adoption is not, instead of kind of like areas of investment that we could put more money into, is for us to focus on a performance base, in the sense that it has to be at least as good as what we currently have, and then pour money into that, because I think that's what's going to drive adoption the most, and get to the point where it can go to the masses. So for me, from that perspective, if we can work towards performance based and can make that assessment, I think that becomes really appealing. The other component in terms of areas to invest is, I do think that, at least I personally would like for us to focus more to get to a point where bio alternatives don't have a lot of the other ingredients, and can we get to a point where we can simplify the ingredient list so that a shoe is mostly or entirely recyclable in some way? And there's a whole stack related to that, between the uppers and then the adhesives and the glues, and kind of tackle that whole range and kind of see it from a system perspective and feel like there's an end in sight. And then the third is, I do like to focus on basically upstream materials, so less so on recycling and whether or not it's biodegradable, but kind of have that from the very start, where you're not relying on recycling, but that we can just kind of, instead of saying, oh, how do we collect, like microfiber shedding, can we just have something that doesn't shed, period? And so I like kind of more of an upstream approach. And for us, that's a longer, timeline and more development, but that's kind of how we differentiate investing on the material impact side, is to kind of focus on that, so that we can take a larger step rather than an incremental change.
Very, very interesting. Last but not least, Heather, where is investment most needed?
This is a tough crowd to follow. My gosh, you three covered pretty much everything. I mean, from scale up perspective, obviously, to reiterate on Karla's point, that's something that's needed. And to go back to something that I think Steve mentioned here, and Corinna just referenced again, is like functionality. These products they can't be on par. They have to be better. But not only that, they have to cost less, right? Or at least as little. I mean, in 2019, we saw millions of hides were burned or destroyed in the US because the consumer appetite for leather just wasn't there. And part of the reason that was the case was because there's all these polyurethane fake leather replacements that were far less expensive. So companies were rushing to utilize them in their processes. The other thing that I would say is just make sure that you're, thinking about plugging your material into existing manufacturing processes, because that's also going to help producers integrate your material into their existing processes, which will help keep costs down as well.
Thank you. I think now I'll try to take some audience questions, and then we'll come back to do a bit of a trend projection to end this panel. All right. So first question from Craig. Other than offtake agreements, what makes a good brand partner? What do you value from brand engagement with your portfolio companies? What headaches do we create? Does anyone want to take this question?
I'll take this.
Thank you.
I love this question. Thanks for asking it, Craig. We see a lot of brands who want to engage with startups but don't yet know the right way. And it kind of depends on the startup and the brand. And I think when we coach brands on this, we should help them figure out a phased approach. So maybe they have a certain budget and appetite for a certain type of material or something that they offtakes is perfect. And they can do offtakes. They can be that. Sometimes maybe there's a certain fiber they want to be known to bring to market. And so they're going to step in at like the pilot stage. And that requires a whole other set of resources, whether it's maybe the smartest way is just to connect them over to your suppliers and let them work with your suppliers, and your suppliers know what you need. We've seen situations where it works to do it that way, and where it doesn't work as well, where the brand and the material company might be trying to work, but they really needed that middleman that was the actual next step in the supply chain from the fiber to the material. And so, really asking what your startup needs, figuring out if investment is the right path. Early on when we were investing, there wasn't very much money in this space. And so corporate VC, like lots of startups had to take that early, a little too early sometimes. Sometimes it was the right timing, but, there's other ways to engage like R&D. Sometimes it's that early investment that shows that there is a market demand for the vision that they're creating. And then it's kind of stepping back and acting as an advisor. So offering up the experts on your team, not just the sustainability team, not the corporate venture team, but the sourcing team, the materials team, the design team, the people who are going to use this technology, to let them act as an advisor to that startup so that they're really learning what's going to be their future demand.
Does anyone else want to add to that?
No, I think Karla covered it really well. Like, I think most brands have difficulty with startups. Like they're just not used to, how startups function and how chaotic it can be. So, I do think they need a bit of a guide when they do start talking to startups. I agree with, putting them in contact with your suppliers, kind of like the development team side of things. They're the folks that they need to talk to.
The last thing I'd really love to add to that is I'm guessing you're from a company, a corporate, and I'm mentioning that because we've seen that there have been development agreements between early startups and global companies that have been a little on the aggressive side. And so for early startups, they have to be really cognizant of the contracts that they're signing, because in certain circumstances, those global corporates that have really powerful lawyers can put language in there that would seem to represent that they own part of the whatever it is that they're co-developing, or whatever it is that the early startup has developed for their brand. So understanding those legal contracts is really important, and just try not to be quite so aggressive with our startups.
Thank you, Heather. Another question from the audience, Eric. Given that you all see lots of new companies trying to get started, which fashion-related materials would you say are currently overdone, and which have the most space for new players to enter?
Can I take that, or at least provide a response? I'm getting pretty jazzed about biosynthetics. Synthetics are used in many places on a number of things, and we don't really have a super good option yet. I know we're doing leathers and things, but I think it's interesting to use in bio and engineer biosynthetics in which we can improve. Where we have a very much like the same hand feel, but that we can improve biodegradability, reduce emissions, and so forth. And I think that's an intriguing fellow in the sense that, and I think this is a good example of it being a bit more high tech, but it's a good alternative because I think we need to think real hard about how can we displace and provide a good alternative for synthetics in general, and it's still a really tough nut to crack in terms of like nylon. So for me, I think biosynthetics are an interesting place.
Thank you, Corinna. Anyone want to add to that?
I'm just
Is there
going to
any-
second that.
Is
That's
any
exactly
category-
where we're excited about.
I think part of that question, what probably Eric wants to find out, is any category already overdone? Too crowded, saturated?
I think we see a lot of companies bubbling up in recycling materials, resale in all aspects of it, which is still exciting, and also bio leathers. There's good amount in silks, but the thing is that we haven't yet. They haven't scaled yet. We haven't proven that the net is cracked, right? We're still, where is the burger that tastes like meat? Kind of, we've been talking about that this whole conference, but so I don't want to say that there's one area that's oversaturated or not. I like to focus in on what's working, what's not within those spaces, and see what kind of innovation can unlock what we need to get it to be that it tastes like meat, if that's where we're headed. But yeah, so we don't have a super good alternative. When you look at it, it's like man-made cellulosic fiber. When people say they are sustainable, what do they really have? Recycled poly from plastic bottles, man-made cellulosic fiber that's certified from maybe lensing. Like, great, that's a great start there, but we haven't cracked it. Those aren't gonna be the places that we end here. There's so many considerations in the questions someone was talking about, deforestation and man-made cellulosic fiber. We see so much opportunity and waste into that space. So there needs to continue to be innovation across every category.
Well, thank you so much. I think we are at time, and that seems to be a great way to end this, which is that there are a lot of companies. We're still waiting for those poster children. Seems like there's a lot to be done, and we need to continue to improve from here. I want to thank all our panelists, Karla, Corinna, Steve, and Heather, for joining us. Thank you very much. I learned a lot from this panel as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you all. All right, and now we do have a networking break, but actually I'm going to do a little bit of a shameless plug until we go over there. We are hiring for a new position at MII. We are looking for somebody to help with our engagement with fashion, automotive, and home good brands. And so I am going to put our job description in the chat. And if you are interested, please go check it out. It really is a great opportunity to make a big impact in this movement, because that person really does, for us, help match up brands and the material companies and provide a lot of the advice to brands that we're seeing today in all of these questions. And now we can go to our networking break. We do recommend spending some time in the virtual booths where you can find out more about our partners and meet with them face-to-face with a live video chat function. To access the virtual booths, please select Expo on the left-hand side of your screen. And then I will see you back here in about half an hour to hear from an expert attorney on tariffs and regulation.